Denmark is preparing for something no NATO country ever expected to face, the possibility of conflict with the United States if Donald Trump attempts to seize Greenland, the easy way or the hard way. Europe is furious, NATO is wobbling, and for Canada, whose entire northern identity hinges on Arctic stability, this is not a distant storm. It is a direct warning that the rules-based order protecting the North is fracturing fast. What began as another signature Trump outburst has now turned into one of the most dangerous geopolitical shocks of 2026.
Which is that the future of Greenland is a decision for Greenland and for Denmark exclusively. It's their decision.
France, Germany, Britain and others have said that Greenland belongs to its people and that only Denmark and Greenland themselves can decide what happens to it.
The United States is an established power, but one that is gradually turning away from some of its allies and freeing itself from international rules it was still promoting not long ago.
Within days, Trump's rhetoric escalated from mockery to a full strategic threat. He openly declared the U.S. would take Greenland whether Denmark liked it or not, framing it as a national security need. His advisors followed by refusing to rule out military action. For Copenhagen and Brussels, this was no longer bluster. It was a red line crossed. Denmark responded sharply. Leaders warned that any U.S. attack on Greenland, part of the Danish kingdom, would effectively end NATO. For Europe, the threat wasn't theoretical. It was existential. France, Germany, the UK, and others issued a rare joint declaration. Greenland's future belongs only to its people and Denmark. Even Greenland's own government pushed back, reaffirming that they do not want to become Americans, insisting their sovereignty is not negotiable. This wasn't planned diplomacy. It was emergency containment of a crisis ignited by Washington. For Canada, the message from European capitals echoed loudly. The Arctic is no longer a quiet theater. It is becoming the new front line of global power competition. And if Trump is willing to challenge Denmark so aggressively, other northern states, especially Canada, could soon face similar pressure. Trump's case for seizing Greenland, claiming it could fall to Russia or China if the U.S. doesn't act, was quickly dismissed by NATO experts. The truth is simple. NATO already guarantees Greenland's security under Article 5. A foreign attack on Greenland is an attack on the entire alliance. But Trump's argument never really relied on facts. It relied on instinct, dominance, and the belief that geography can be acquired if one is bold enough to ignore the rules. That is why this crisis matters far beyond Greenland. For Canada, this is a wake-up call wrapped in a siren. If Trump believes he can disregard international law to reshape the Arctic, then Canada's own northern sovereignty, its waters, its shipping lanes, its resource basins, becomes an open question. Ottawa has long disagreed with Washington over the Northwest Passage. Historically, NATO unity and legal frameworks kept the dispute peaceful. But if the U.S. now behaves as a predator country, as some Trump advisors explicitly describe, Canada cannot assume the old safeguards will hold. And that is where Ottawa's response becomes critical. Canada is not staying silent. Canada is not neutral. Canada is not waiting for the crisis to settle itself. Ottawa immediately aligned with Europe, publicly rejecting Trump's justification for Greenland and defending the principle that Arctic sovereignty cannot be determined by force. This isn't typical Canadian diplomacy. It's a firm, deliberate stand taken because Canada sees the severity of the moment. Behind the scenes, Canada is moving just as decisively. The government is accelerating Arctic defense planning. Surveillance flights are being increased. NORAD modernization is being pushed faster. Senior officials are reviewing scenarios previously considered unthinkable, scenarios where NATO is weakened or fractured, and Canada must assume more responsibility for northern security. And this crisis is reshaping Canada's foreign policy. Carney's government is deepening ties with Europe, South Korea, and Japan, not as symbolic gestures, but as deliberate diversification away from an increasingly unpredictable U.S. Canada is signaling that no country, even its closest ally, can unilaterally redraw borders in the Arctic without repercussions. And this moment forces Canada to confront a deeper truth. The Arctic is no longer protected by tradition or treaties alone. It now depends on power, capability, and credibility. Ottawa knows that if the U.S. is willing to override Denmark's sovereignty, it could one day apply similar logic to the Northwest Passage or Canadian Arctic waters. That is why officials are quietly engaging with European defense partners, exploring joint Arctic monitoring and intelligence sharing beyond the traditional NORAD structure. Canada is also assessing whether to expand its Arctic Ranger program and accelerate icebreaker procurement, steps designed not to provoke Washington, but to ensure Canada cannot be sidelined in its own northern frontier. This is Canada acting boldly because the alternative is strategic vulnerability.
The Greenland crisis also casts a long shadow over the 2026 USMCA review. If Washington is willing to disregard treaties and ally sovereignty, how stable can a North American trade agreement be? Ottawa is preparing contingency plans, including the possibility of a no-deal USMCA, while expanding Asian and European trade channels. Trump's Arctic gamble doesn't just shake NATO, it rewrites Canada's entire strategic playbook.
Greenland is not just an island, it is the key to the Central Arctic. Whoever controls Greenland controls the air and sea routes across the top of the world. And that's exactly why this crisis threatens Canada so directly. If the U.S. attempts to seize Greenland, it sets a precedent that Arctic territory can be acquired through pressure or force. That precedent would sit only a few hundred kilometers from Nunavut and the Northwest Passage, regions Canada has fought diplomatically for decades to protect. Canada now faces three immediate implications. First, Arctic militarization will accelerate. Russia and China will react. NATO unity will erode. Shipping routes could become contested zones. Canada will bear the brunt of that instability. Second, Canada may need to assume a leadership role in Arctic governance if NATO weakens. With Europe furious and the US unpredictable, a vacuum is emerging, and countries are looking to Canada to provide balance and stability. Third, the USMCA review becomes significantly riskier. Trump's willingness to challenge borders and alliances means negotiations will not be conventional trade talks, they will be leverage exercises. Canada is preparing for that moment now, not in 2026. The bottom line, Trump's Greenland push is not a fringe story, it is a direct threat to Arctic order, to NATO cohesion, and to Canada's long-term national security.
Well, I think that is very much unfortunate because people in Greenland do not want to become part of the United States. They say very clearly they don't want to become Americans, they want to be Greenlanders.
Greenland is the spark, not the fire. The real danger lies in what this crisis reveals. The rules that held the Arctic stable for decades are weakening, and Canada is one of the first countries that will feel the consequences. If Trump is willing to challenge Denmark, confront Europe, and disregard NATO, what happens when the dispute involves Canada's waters, Canada's airspace, or Canada's Arctic claims? The question now isn't whether Greenland is safe. It's whether the entire Arctic is entering a new era, one where Canada must be ready to defend its place more boldly than ever before.
And up until last year, or if we go back to 2019, when Trump first floated the idea of, back then it was buying Greenland, not taking over, as it looks like, it sounds more like now. People just, I don't think any country would like someone coming in to steal territory.
Denmark just told Donald Trump to keep his hands off Greenland, and they didn't sugarcoat it. The message was sharp, unapologetic, and rooted in national pride. But the part no one in Washington seems to have noticed is this. While Denmark publicly shuts down Trump's Arctic ambitions, Canada is quietly becoming the Arctic power the U.S. can no longer overlook. Trump may be talking about Greenland again, but Canada is the country actually shaping the future of the North. The story began when Trump revived one of his most bizarre foreign policy ideas, that the United States should take over or even acquire Greenland. It's a notion he first floated in 2019, and now, in his second term, he's bringing it back with even more confidence. The Danish response was immediate. A senior commentator, reflecting the public mood, said bluntly that Greenland is part of Denmark in the same way Hawaii or Alaska are part of the United States. Her exact words cut through the noise. No one wants someone coming in to steal territory. She also reminded viewers that the United States already has significant military presence in Greenland through the 1951 Defense Agreement, but only because Denmark allows it. In other words, Washington can deploy assets, but Copenhagen still holds the keys. Greenland, for its part, is an autonomous nation within the Kingdom of Denmark. It has its own culture, its own government, and a long history of resisting any attempt, especially from superpowers, to dictate its future. So when Trump floated the idea of U.S. control again, both Denmark and Greenland pushed back immediately and forcefully. One thing is clear. Trump's attempt to reassert U.S. dominance in the Arctic is running into the limits of U.S. influence. He may talk about Greenland as if it were real estate, but Denmark isn't selling, and Greenland isn't interested. The whole episode exposes a weakness in Trump's foreign policy approach. Allies don't appreciate being treated like properties, and sovereign nations push back when you try. What makes this moment even more damaging for Washington is that it arrives during a period of already strained alliances. Trump's tariff fights with Canada, tensions with Europe, and unpredictable diplomatic messaging have all contributed to a broader sense that the United States is no longer the steady hand it once was. While Trump creates friction, Canada is quietly building partnerships. Canada and Greenland resolved their last territorial disagreement, the Hans Island dispute, through peaceful negotiation in 2022, creating an atmosphere of trust between Ottawa and Nuuk. Since then, Canada has leaned into deeper cooperation, from climate research to Indigenous governance and Arctic transportation links. Ottawa is preparing to open a consulate in Nuuk, something no Canadian government had ever prioritized until now. This isn't symbolic. It reflects a long-term strategy. Canada wants a direct diplomatic presence in Greenland at a time when Greenland's leaders are actively looking for stable, respectful partners. Prime Minister Mark Carney's Arctic strategy is also accelerating. Canada is strengthening its satellite systems, upgrading northern defense infrastructure, and enhancing coastal surveillance, all while investing in local communities and respecting Indigenous leadership. Unlike the U.S. approach, Canada isn't trying to take over anything. It's building relationships, and those relationships are bearing fruit. The world is paying attention to the Arctic in a way it hasn't before. Melting ice is opening new shipping routes. Russia is expanding its military footprint. China is positioning itself as a near-Arctic state as it funnels money into research stations and mineral projects. In this crowded landscape, Canada stands out for its combination of diplomacy, stability, and geography. Ottawa now controls the political tone of the North in ways nobody expected 5 years ago. It's not loud, it's not flashy, but it's effective. What makes this shift even more significant is that Arctic alliances are no longer determined by military power alone. Nations are placing greater weight on environmental stewardship, Indigenous partnership, and long-term resource governance. Canada's credibility in these areas gives it influence that sheer force cannot replicate. As the region warms and competition intensifies, countries are increasingly looking for partners who bring legitimacy and predictability, qualities Canada now projects more clearly than either Washington or Moscow. Denmark's decision to confront Trump is more than a bilateral disagreement. It shifts the balance of power in the Arctic. By shutting down Trump's Greenland talk so publicly, Denmark reinforces a fundamental truth. The United States doesn't automatically lead in the North anymore. And that opens an enormous opportunity for Canada. Unlike Trump's White House, Canada has treated Greenland with respect. It has emphasized cooperation, not control. And Greenland's leaders have responded positively because Canada's approach aligns with their own values, especially around climate resilience, education, and responsible development. The contrast is stark. Trump's approach raises suspicions. Canada's approach builds trust. That's how influence works in the Arctic today. This moment reveals a dramatic divide between two countries that share the world's longest border. Trump's America is increasingly confrontational, unpredictable, and focused on short-term victories. Carney's Canada is steady, pragmatic, and positioning itself as a long-term partner for northern nations. Canada is meeting NATO's defense target early, investing in new submarines and patrol vessels, and modernizing northern infrastructure from Nunavut to the Northwest Territories. These aren't symbolic gestures. They're signals that Canada intends to be a decisive Arctic power, not because it wants to dominate the region, but because it wants to shape it responsibly. As Denmark pushes back against U.S. overreach, Canada is quietly demonstrating the qualities Arctic nations value most: stability, respect, and consistency. And here's what's becoming increasingly clear. The Arctic is shifting toward a multipolar model where influence is earned through credibility, not coercion. Canada's ability to balance defense modernization with diplomacy gives it a unique advantage. While Washington wrestles with political turbulence, Ottawa is presenting a calm, coherent Arctic vision, one that resonates with governments from Copenhagen to Reykjavik, and, crucially, with leaders in Nuuk who are seeking predictable partners during a period of global tension. Denmark's blunt message to Trump, "Hands off Greenland," was more than a territorial stand. It was a statement about sovereignty, partnership, and the future of Arctic governance. For the first time in a long time, the United States isn't the dominant voice in the region. The vacuum is being filled not by aggression or ambition, but by diplomacy, and Canada is the country most ready to step into that role. The question now is whether Washington will recognize this shifting Arctic landscape, or whether Trump will continue pushing ideas that alienate allies and strengthen Canada's hand. Either way, the Arctic is changing, and this time, Canada is shaping the map.
Ground has officially been broken on Volkswagen's PowerCo electric vehicle battery gigafactory in St. Thomas.
This is the world's largest automaker. They don't do a plan for just this year while Donald Trump's got tariffs. They're doing a plan looking forward.
Canada just scored a win that cuts through all the noise of the North American trade war. While Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs, emergency orders, and political theatrics, the world's largest automaker quietly made its choice, and it wasn't the United States. Volkswagen broke ground on its PowerCo EV battery gigafactory in St. Thomas, Ontario, the largest facility of its kind in Canadian history. And in a moment that should make Washington pause, a local official said the part no one in the U.S. wants to admit. This is the world's largest automaker. They don't make a plan for just this year while Donald Trump's got tariffs. They're making a plan looking forward. That single sentence captures the entire story tonight. Canada is the long-term bet. Trump's America is the short-term gamble.
The milestone kicks off development of 3 major buildings at the site, making it the largest facility of its kind in the country, with full production expected to begin in 2027. The facility is set to create up to 3,000 direct jobs, while protecting Ontario's auto manufacturing supply chain amidst the trade war.
Volkswagen's PowerCo has officially moved into full construction, marking the start of a multi-year industrial transformation for southwestern Ontario. The St. Thomas site is now home to 3 major buildings rising out of the ground, with full EV battery production set for 2027. The project promises around 3,000 direct jobs and thousands more across suppliers and the regional economy. For a community long tied to the ups and downs of the auto sector, this investment feels like a turning point, not just for employment, but for identity. Mayor Joe Preston described the factory as generational change that would allow families to stay, work, buy homes, and build a vibrant future without being forced to leave in search of opportunity. Yet the celebration comes with a message aimed well beyond Ontario. Volkswagen chose Canada at a moment when the United States is entering its most unpredictable trade cycle in years. Trump's new tariff regime has introduced a level of uncertainty that multinational companies simply cannot build billion-dollar strategies around. In contrast, Canada is executing a long-term industrial plan with clarity, consistency, and political alignment. And the timing is crucial. As global automakers race to secure stable access to batteries and minerals, any country offering predictability becomes a magnet for investment. Canada stepped into that role decisively. The groundwork now being poured in St. Thomas signals not only the rise of a factory, but the emergence of a national manufacturing strategy finally aligned with global demand. Companies do not fear high taxes or strict regulations as much as they fear unpredictability, and that unpredictability now defines U.S. trade policy under Donald Trump. His administration has imposed sweeping tariffs under IEEPA and Section 232, triggering retaliatory threats, court challenges, and mounting frustration from manufacturers. Reuters and Bloomberg both describe Trump's tariff landscape as one of the biggest business risks in North America today. Volkswagen saw all of this and walked the other way. It did not want a political gamble. It wanted a predictable, rules-based environment, and it found that in Canada. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada is presenting itself as a country that plans for decades, not for election cycles. Ottawa is building full EV supply chains from minerals to manufacturing, offering long-term investment credits, securing international partnerships, and pushing to double non-U.S. exports within 10 years. Volkswagen doesn't choose sites based on short-term headlines. It chooses based on energy stability, predictable climate policy, critical mineral access, and workforce reliability. Canada met every requirement. The United States, under Trump's tariff-driven strategy, did not. The calculation was simple. Canada is the safer investment, Canada is the smarter investment, and Canada is the forward-looking investment. Trump's goal was to force manufacturing back onto U.S. soil, but the outcome has been the opposite. By destabilizing cross-border supply chains and raising import costs unpredictably, Trump made the U.S. a riskier place to build long-term industrial projects. Volkswagen responded exactly how a global automaker would. It chose the country with stability, critical minerals, clean electricity, and a government capable of delivering consistent industrial policy. Even the messaging from Ontario officials reinforced this reality. Volkswagen is planning beyond Trump, meaning the company sees the U.S. as too erratic to anchor a generational project. Canada, meanwhile, offers continuity regardless of political turbulence. This is why analysts describe Canada's EV build-out as one of the most strategically coherent industrial pivots in the Western Hemisphere. While the United States spends political energy on tariff battles, Canada is quietly constructing a continent-wide supply chain, stretching from mining towns to battery campuses to export-ready auto plants. The Volkswagen deal is not an outlier. It is a preview of where the industry is moving next. This decision also fits into a broader shift across the world. The U.S. is facing a surge of corporate lawsuits over Trump's emergency tariffs. Mexico has warned of reassessing its own manufacturing strategy. Europe is preparing retaliatory measures if U.S. tariff escalations continue. China's rare earth leverage remains a looming pressure point despite the temporary truce negotiated at APEC 2025. Canada, however, is moving in the opposite direction, building stability, broadening trade ties in Asia, and offering companies like Volkswagen a future insulated from Washington's political storms. The St. Thomas Gigafactory is not an isolated win. It is the industrial expression of a country repositioning itself for a more multipolar economic world. For Canada, this project is a declaration of industrial confidence. It signals that the country can win global-scale factories, build complete EV ecosystems, and compete directly with the United States. It strengthens local economies, secures high-quality employment, and anchors Canada firmly in the clean technology manufacturing race. More importantly, it proves something Canadians often forget. When the world looks for reliability, it looks north. For the U.S., the implications are significant. Tariff chaos does not attract investment. Consistency does. Volkswagen's choice demonstrates that Trump's protectionist strategy is not reshoring industry, it is pushing it away. The U.S. had every structural advantage: larger markets, larger workforces, aggressive incentive programs, and political pressure on automakers to stay domestic. Yet when Volkswagen had to place a once-in-a-generation investment, it chose Canada. It should not be a mystery why. Companies can manage competition, they cannot manage chaos.
The groundbreaking in St. Thomas is more than a milestone for Canada's EV future. It is a moment of clarity for North America. Volkswagen made its choice, and in doing so, revealed the deeper truth shaping global industry. The future belongs to the country that can think beyond the next press conference. Canada is offering stability, clean energy, long-term planning, and a government aligned behind a coherent industrial strategy. Trump's America is offering unpredictability, tariff shockwaves, and policies that shift faster than companies can build factories. Volkswagen saw the difference. The world sees it too. And if more companies follow the same logic, Canada will not just keep pace, it will lead.
This is really a catalytic moment for Canada and for our government, and I say that because we've got a Prime Minister who has brought the importance of the Arctic and sovereignty that is not recognized by countries like Russia and our friends, the United States.
I think it's about time Canada government need to focus on what are the beneficial for Canada. It's Arctic. It's that one particular area. This particular project is the one that could shovel ready in 2026.
Canada just made the boldest northern move in a generation. After decades of talking about Arctic sovereignty, decades of warning about foreign interest in the Northwest Passage, and decades of letting others develop while we stood still, Nunavut's Inuit leadership has stepped forward with something transformative. A fully permitted, community-backed deep-sea port at Qikiqtarjuaq that is ready to begin construction as early as spring 2026. At a moment when the United States is distracted by President Donald Trump's tariff battles, Russia is expanding its northern military infrastructure, and China is quietly investing across the circumpolar world, Canada is finally stepping into the arena, and it's doing so in the one place where presence is power, the Arctic. This port is not just an infrastructure project, it is Canada deciding, at long last, to take the North seriously. The recent press conference brought together Qikiqtaaluk Corporation, the Qikiqtani Inuit Association, and business leaders like John Risley to deliver a single, unmistakable message to Ottawa. The port is ready to go, and Canada needs to move with it. For more than 15 years, this project has been studied, reviewed, and analyzed. It has passed environmental assessments. It has earned full community approval. The location sits next to one of the richest turbot fishing grounds in the country. Yet, because Nunavut has no deep-water port, ships harvesting from Nunavut waters are forced to unload in Greenland or in far-off southern jurisdictions. Every trip that ends outside the territory drains at least $1 million in direct value, revenue that leaves the region before it ever has a chance to support local jobs or local development. The port site already has a 3,800-foot airstrip that can be extended into a tactical base. Defense officials have expressed interest because traffic in the Davis Strait is rising, and Canada lacks permanent infrastructure in the area. And with Northwest Passage shipping activity expected to increase over the next decade, Qikiqtarjuaq sits at the gateway of a corridor that global powers are watching very closely. The project's cost has risen to approximately $350 million for Phase 1, with just over $53 million already secured. But what matters most is this: the port is shovel-ready, fully permitted and capable of beginning construction in the spring of 2026, provided Ottawa steps forward as a partner, whether through Coast Guard presence, defense tenancy, or national infrastructure funding. This moment is not a plea. It is a challenge to the federal government to finally match the ambition of the communities that live in the North. For years, Canada has watched other Arctic states build ports, runways, military bases, and research hubs while we hesitated. Russia constructed an entire chain of northern ports. Norway equipped its far north region with modern deep-water facilities. China declared a polar Silk Road and made long-term investments in pre-Arctic logistics. Even the United States, despite its own slow pace, has at least moved forward on upgrading northern military infrastructure. Meanwhile, Canada mostly held press conferences. Nunavut's leaders captured the problem perfectly when they said Canada had nothing in the Arctic compared to its peers. This port is the moment the country stops being the silent Arctic nation, the one with the longest coastline but the least infrastructure, and starts being a real participant in northern geopolitics.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has already signaled that the Arctic will become a central pillar of Canada's nation-building agenda. Reuters recently reported that his government plans to expand Arctic presence with new year-round operations and a long-term security commitment. Unlike previous administrations that focused on symbolic gestures, Carney views Arctic infrastructure as a structural investment, something permanent, something strategic, something that strengthens Canada for decades, not election cycles. The Kikikjuork port aligns perfectly with this new doctrine. It is Indigenous-led, it is economically sound, and it is geographically irreplaceable.
What makes this project even more powerful is who is leading it. This is not a Southern corporation imposing a project from outside. It is driven by Inuit organizations, Qiktialik Corporation and the Qiktaani Inuit Association, who understand the land, the waters, and the long-term economic needs of the region. When northern communities take ownership, projects gain legitimacy. Environmental oversight is stronger, benefits stay in the region, and the work is grounded in stewardship rather than extraction. Canada's sovereignty is always strongest when Indigenous leadership is at the center. This port proves that point.
Right now, Nunavut's fishing industry produces enormous value, but almost all of that value leaves immediately because the territory has nowhere to unload, process, or ship catch. By forcing vessels to offload outside Nunavut, Canada effectively exports jobs, GDP, and tax revenue before it ever touches Inuit communities. A functioning deep-sea port changes everything. Fisheries can unload at home. Processing can happen in the region. Tourism can flourish with proper docking capacity. Marine services and shipping logistics can finally exist. For the first time, Nunavut can keep the wealth that comes from its own waters. This is economic sovereignty as much as geographic sovereignty.
The United States is not paying attention to the Arctic. Under Trump's second administration, Washington is consumed by tariff wars, legal challenges, and corporate pushback. Arctic infrastructure is nowhere near the top of America's priority list. That creates a rare strategic opening. Canada can build, quietly, decisively, while the U.S. is distracted. For once, Canadian sovereignty is not being overshadowed by American power. Instead, Canada is seizing the initiative. NATO has been demanding stronger Arctic infrastructure from Canada for years. A deep seaport capable of hosting Coast Guard vessels, naval ships, tactical aircraft, and search and rescue operations gives Canada exactly the credibility it has been missing. This project doesn't just strengthen northern communities, it strengthens Canada's standing in the alliance.
The most powerful part of this project is not the concrete or the cranes or the dollars. It is the shift in mindset. For too long, Canada treated the North as something distant, expensive, and symbolic. Now the country is treating it as the center of future strategy, economic, military, environmental, and national. This port is the first chapter of a new Arctic era. The Qikiktarjuaq Deep Sea Port is not a proposal. It is not a concept. It is a project ready to break ground in spring 2026. If Ottawa steps forward, Canada will enter the next decade not as a bystander in the Arctic, but as a builder, a leader, and a nation investing in its longest coastline. The countdown has started.
Now the question is simple: will Canada meet it?